Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson. We're going to close the 13th chapter in the book of Matthew. We're going to cover the post-parabolic material today, which is from the ranges of 51 through all the way to the end to 58. And what we're going to do in our review is not focus on the parables, but focus on the receptivity which we must cultivate when we read these parables. So first off, what a parable is an instructive illustration which uses sceneries from familiar everyday life or commonly observed phenomenon in nature, and it is intended to impart or illuminate a didactic truth, a spiritual or morally beneficial truth. And these parables are not just any parables. First off, parables was the customary practice according to which contemporaneous Jewish rabbis were in the fashion of teaching. They all taught in parables, but so far did Yahshua exceed them all that he is actually called the father of parables. So his parables are on a whole nother level than anyone else's, and they are majestic to behold. But the reason why he resorted to them is because the opposition had intensified. The mounting opposition against him had intensified to the point where he was no longer at liberty to express his message in these simple, unveiled truths of simplicity, such as we witness in the Sermon of the Mount, chapter 5 through 7. From henceforth, he primarily teaches through parables, the meaning of which is not always audience. The first of which is, the parable of the soil and the seeds. Well, it's more commonly known as the parable of the seed, which is the word, which is a life-giving source, which can produce spiritual life in those who catch it. But we have to cultivate the soils of our heart. So I think the soil, but in between that is the material we're going to mostly review. Verse 10, and the disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? And he answering said to them, because it has been given to you to know the secrets of the kingdom of the heavens, but to them it has been not given. So the parables are a dividing mark which separate the sheep from the goats. And some people get them and embrace them, and they understand the kingdom through the reading this and benefiting from it and knowing what it means and what it means for the kingdom and what that is and what it is in their lives. So they are privileged. They are in a privileged position of accessibility and access to just these great kingdom truths. For whoever possesses, to him more shall be given, and he shall have overflowingly. But whoever does not possess, even what he possesses shall be taken away from him. So it's going to get better if you stick with it and you just you embrace it and utilize the most of the opportunity as it comes their way. Whenever personal revelation visits you, you have to respond responsibly in order to be entrusted with more advanced stages and tiers of information which are based on the foundations of your previous personal revelations. Revelation demands responsibility and doctrine demands duty. The Bible observes no, strictly speaking, no separation between the two, and neither should we. But the opposite end is if we do not make the most of it, if we neglect it, then it's all over for us. So that's why you can get stuck in a spiritual state of stupor in which you do not advance because you do not respond responsibly to the revelation as you have been given it and as you understand it. Because of this I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. He's speaking of an apostate generation which bears an uncannily accurate echo of Isaiah's generation, a spiritually blind people whose minds were chained to the earth, so they were in the motions of sacrificing in Isaiah's, and they were just all about legalism in the Savior's first century. So they had the message, but they did not make the most of it. They were in the privileged position, and they failed to live up to their potential, and they failed to grasp it and run with it and make the most of it. But those who do get it, the ones who, how privileged are we who embrace the mysteries of the kingdom. And blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. So one of the principles that we have to extract from our plenary analysis of the parables is that the human heart is not, the ear will not hear what the heart is not prepared or willing to comprehend. So it's all a heart matter, and that's what gives us the spiritual sounds. So there are voices, physical voices. I'm speaking to you now in a physical voice, but I'm also conveying spiritual truth. So if you have these ears of the Spirit, you'll be able to unlock and connect with this and continue and stick with it. And blessed are you for it. For truly I say to you that many prophets and righteous ones long to see what you see and did not see, and hear what you hear and did not hear it. He wants them to know how lucky they are to have him in this midst. He is the one that the prophets point aside to, the righteous ones live for, in the expectation of him. Job cried out for him, all throughout the Old Testament. He is there. The prophets of the prior dispensation, righteous men, bold, dynamic, courageous, hall of faith men, and they did not know what the disciples know and what we, as future tense disciples, he's speaking to a present audience, but Matthew is writing to posterity. And then there's a few one-word parables that are self-evident. So the parable of the seeds in the soil, it consists of a parable, then an explanation. So we have no way of knowing it without the explanation, and the disciples are privileged to understand what comes after it. Then he speaks to him of another one, and now the following 6 are kingdom parables. The kingdom of heaven has become like, this is the wheat and the wares parable, and then he explains it eventually, but in between are 3 simple ones, the mustard seed and the yeast, which are self-explanatory, self-evident. They don't need, they're one verse parables. And then a mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds, but from it grows an imposing plant that is as tall as 10 feet in height. And so from humble beginnings grow great things is the mustard seed analogy. And leaven would have been familiar. That's the yeast that gives rise to the bread, and it's usually depicted negatively in Scripture. But then, he gives the explanation to the disciples of the meaning of the parable of the wheats and the wine. So this is, we've heard 4 so far, and then we hear 3 more in verses 44 through 47, those being the treasure hidden in the field, the pearl of great price. And I've heard an interesting interpretation recently of it being an analogy of Israel who had the privilege, and yet they buried it in their midst, and they just did not recognize him when he was with them. They missed the pearl of great price in their midst. And it's also likened to a net, and this brings us back to the call of the disciples, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, and also Peter and Andrew, brothers, were fishers, and at least maybe 7 of his disciples were fishermen. So that analogy and thing would have been instantly connected. They were called to be fishers of men, but the fish net that he's referring to divides between heaven and hell, goats and sheaf, wheat from chaff. So we left off at the 50th verse, and we probably should have taken it to the 51st, but for whatever reason we didn't, so we're going to take it up from there. Joshua said to them, "Have you understood all this?" They said to him, "Yes, Master." Simple yes and no answer question exchange. He wants them to know, have you understood it? He knows that they've heard it, but do you understand? I have said it, but now I know you've listened to it, but do you really understand what they say it? And they affirm, yes, we have no reason to deny. This is the disciples who are privileged and to know, and not the ordinary audience. And he said to them, "Therefore every scholar taught in the kingdom of the heaven is like a householder who brings out of his treasure new and old." So this is actually semi-parabolic. I know we earlier described this as the post-parabolic section of the chapter, but he's referring to 2 distinct covenants, the old, which is fading and passing away and being replaced by the new, but those who are privileged to live in the dawn of the new dispensation will bring the treasures of the old to the new, and it will not, so in some sense the old will remain eternally alive and connected to the new, which is in their midst. And the scholars, he was not an educated scholar. He taught with authority, but his authority came from his father. He was educated and literate, as was the ordinary Jew, but educated to be a rabbi he was not. He was no scholar, yet he exceeded the scholar in all his wisdom from the beginning. And so he bridges the old and the new as well as humanity to divinity. And it came to be when Yahshua had ended these parables that he left there. So this is an indication of a departure of scene. Now much of what we earlier read was words and writings. Now we read descriptions of reactions and events, and not so much dialogue or things of that nature. So they are where they were. He was teaching from a boat on a lake in the beginning of the 13th chapter. So they are somewhere in the region of Galilee, which is around the Sea of Galilee, the north region to the north of Samaria, which is the north of Judea. And when he had come to his own country, he taught them in their synagogues, so that they were astonished and said, "Where does this one get this wisdom and miracles?" His own country would have been Nazareth. This is the town where he spent the first 30 years of his life in obscure anonymity, no attention, no fanfare, nothing extraordinary or expected of him. And then he kind of burst on the scene, and he's returning to his own, just 2 short years ago. Well, the first year that he was there, in Luke's account, they drove him to the edge of the cliff. This is the first place that Luke places the master visiting after emerging triumphant over the temptation in the desert. He goes to his hometown in Nazareth and declares the writing of Isaiah 61 fulfilled in their midst, and the town doesn't like it. These are the people he grew up with, and they push him to the edge of a cliff, but his time had not yet come, so he escapes it. And they were astonished because he taught with authority. There was a power and an allurement and an attraction and something exciting and enriching and beyond belief in what he taught and what he did. And, they knew him in human terms, and they wanted to know, where does this wisdom on high come, and the ability to perform the miracles? Where does this one get this power? And they're thinking of him, their eyes are chained to the earth, so they are approaching him in a purely human lens. And to restrict Yahshua to a mere mortal or man is to deny his divinity and to deny his enabling power to work on your behalf. Is this not the son of the carpenter? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers Jacob and Joseph and Simon and Jude? So they knew his father was a carpenter. He would have been trained to be a carpenter. His father was also an alabaster maker, I think. But the father would have been dead at this point. He is identified by name as Joseph in the first chapter. He is visited by angels twice in the first 2 chapters. And then we don't read of him since, but his mother is still alive, and she is also present, or at least, known and living in the midst of these people. They knew all his his kins, they were neighbors, and they knew him too. And his brothers' names, James, Joseph, Simon, Jude. We recognize 2 of those names as authors of epistles in the New Testament, James and Jude. The evidence indicates in John 7:5 that the brothers did not believe him to be who he said he was in their own lifetime, and they urged him to make himself known, to reveal himself at the Temple of Shelters, and he sort of sneaks in on his own terms. But in any case, after the resurrection, both James and Jude became a stalwart bishop, the leading figure in Jerusalem, which was early the capital assembly of the. And Jude also penned the short but dramatic 1-chapter epistle, which occurs before the book of Revelation. A lot of exciting stuff there. Much of it is based on Jewish apocryphal literature that we are not familiar with personally. And his sisters, and they not all with us. And where did this one get all this? So we learned that he not only had brothers, we not only know that he had brothers, we knew that they had names, but we only know that he had sisters, and that's just because females were not, afforded an equal dignity in the ancient world. And, Matthew's just a creature of his time. We cannot put him down, it wasn't anything sexist or anything like that. But, the same thing is this is the same question. Where then did this one get all this? We know him to be connected by blood and related by grew up right in their house, and these were his brothers, these were his sisters, this was his mother. He was the son of a carpenter. He was a carpenter. He was training to be a carpenter. Then he became a rabbi without having gone through the ordinary educational process. And they want to know, where does he get all this authority and this power and this wonder? And it's because he was the Word who became flesh and pitched a tent among men. He was man and more than a man. He was the Son of Elohim, and Elohim himself, who was in the beginning with him before the beginning and was him. And they stumbled at him, but Yahshua said to them, a prophet is not unappreciated except in his own country and in his own house. So stumbling is a common reaction, and in fact, in the first parable, the parable of the soil, we read that there are 3 types of soils and seeds, combination in soils, which produce different effects. So 3 out of 4 people maybe stumble at him, or throw in the towel when the persecution comes in, or gets trapped by the worries of the world, to bring us back to that. But a lot of people stumble over him because they find his claim to be the exclusive access point to divinity in heaven to be offensive. They don't like anyone exalting themselves on a pedestal. And if you think of him in merely human terms, then you have to think of him as a lunatic, because only one who was stark raving mad and was a human would ever claim to be God in the flesh. So that's a test of faith, and one that we shouldn't stumble over. But the quotation itself, a prophet is not unappreciated except. So these were the people who knew him, and when he was a stranger, these people had never seen anything like him. They had never seen anyone like him, but the denizens of his own town, by virtue of growing up with him, had seen someone like him. Just, they'd never see anything like it, but they knew him as a person and a human. And so they neglected him, and they were a rustic, agrarian hick town. They were a despised and rejected city, as was he, but he was despised and rejected even among his own. And he did not do miracles there because of their unbelief. So this is a negative equation of why miracles do not work wonders on the behalf of those who are faithless. Only the faithful have an awareness of the miraculous, and the truth is that miracles do take place even in the lives of unbelievers, but they just miss them. It's divinity trying to reach out to them. He proves his existence in these miracles that exist all day, every day, throughout the day. And but also people, they can't manipulate miracles to their own advantage because of their unbelief. That is an act of faith to tempt the Father to even presume to put him in your death, because that's a man-centered worship where God is omnipotent but not sovereign, and we want to give him all his attributes and all his due. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.